What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the First Class Lacrosse Podcast. Conference tournaments are heating up in women's lacrosse, and men's conference seedings are starting to align. Today, we have special guest Adam Lamberti, Director of FCL Media and PLL Draft Analyst, joining us. I'm also joined by my co-hosts Stephen Rehfuss and Matt Dunn. Matt, I'm going to pass it off to you to introduce today's segments.
Thank you, Deemer. Today, we're going to kick it off with our 2-minute drill with Stephen Rehfuss. After that, we will get into our player's perspective segment. Today, we're going to talk about the balance of being good at everything or great at a few things. We actually got a good inbound question from an athlete about that. After that, we'll get to our GPUs, which are our games, players, and units, where we highlight from this prior weekend some of those that really stood out to us. After that, we will get into the breakdown where we bring in Adam Lamberti to talk about the college season and PLL draft prospects. And lastly, we will look ahead at some notable games this upcoming weekend. Stephen, why don't you kick us off here with the 2-minute drill?
So some big games on the men's and women's side. From last weekend in the Ivy League, Cornell with a big win over Harvard 2012. Richmond, a huge win over UMass. It wasn't close. It was 14-5 in favor of Richmond. Flipping over to the ACC, two big games this weekend. Notre Dame beat UNC 12-6. UNC was up 4-1 at half. We'll dive into that one a little bit deeper later. Duke with a huge win over Syracuse at home, 11-7. Syracuse was scoreless in the first and the third quarters. Flipping over to the Big Ten, Ohio State over Michigan, 10-6. Michigan was up 8-5 with less than 6 minutes to play in the game, and Ohio State ended up walking away with the win. Maryland, big win at home, 11-8 over Hopkins. Penn State, dominant win over Rutgers, 12-4. And then flipping to the Big East, one of the more confusing conferences of this season, Providence beating Denver 10-6. That was the first ever win for Providence over Denver. We are recording this podcast on Thursday morning. So yesterday being Wednesday for the women's side was a huge day for the ACC tournament and the Big Ten tournament. Out of the ACC, we saw UNC beat Virginia Tech 19-9. Clemson beat Duke 15-7. BC beating UVA by 10, 17-7, and then Stanford with a big win over Syracuse 15-10. Big Ten had 3 games. Hopkins beat Penn State 13-8. Maryland beat Rutgers 17-11, and then Michigan with a huge win 20-9 over USC. So notable performances, keeping the list a little bit shorter this week. Jack Frassione, the Penn State goalie, 76 save percentage versus Rutgers, and he also scored a goal. Chris Kavanaugh, Notre Dame attack. Obviously, Chris Kavanaugh, really talented player. We haven't talked about him a ton. He had 4 goals in the comeback win over UNC. Jackson Eicher, we've said his name a lot on the podcast. He's been putting up crazy numbers. Army attack, he had 7 goals and 3 assists against Bucknell. And then 2 Duke guys that I want to shout out from their big win over Syracuse. Aiden McGuire, he had 2 goals and 1 assist for Syracuse. He is probably the best defensive midfielder in the country. And then Matt Christmas, the Duke LSM, he had 1 goal versus Syracuse. And not only that, he tied the school record for pull goals in the season, which was set by CJ Costabile with 7 on the season. So really impressive transition from those 2 and wanted to shout them out.
I like to think we were early to the Army attack train in terms of lacrosse media this spring. So Eicher's been one since early March that we've been talking a lot about.
It's funny when we do this, like we always talk about wanting to highlight the right people that stand out, but sometimes you get fatigued when it's the same names over and over again. I think CJ Kurse could easily be on this list almost every week. You mentioned Chris Kavanaugh's having a quiet season by the standards of Chris Kavanaugh. Eicher's been on this list a lot. I feel like Sam King has been on this list a lot throughout the season and maybe sometimes isn't as much because of that reason. But those are definitely a few of the names I feel like we've seen pretty steadily on here.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, CJ Kurse and even Ryan Goldstein, they're putting up 6 to 8 points every week. Eicher has been, incredibly impressive. He's got 45 goals on the season, 73 points. If Army makes a run, does he get himself into consideration for the, Twerton top 5? We'll see. I do feel like that race is pretty open. But overall, a really good weekend of men's college lacrosse. And then it was fun to have, the women's game. Deemer, I know that you were at the Michigan game, I believe. But the woman, getting into conference tournament play, it's only in April, but the season, coming down to the wire here.
It's crazy to have these conference tournaments too, which we're not used to on the men's side, that have 3 and 4 games in a day. So it's just a marathon of awesome lacrosse, and it's a Wednesday. So they're going Wednesday, Friday, Sunday in ACC and Big Tens. Also, really cool. I was thinking about this before the podcast today. How about reading off the ACC women's semifinals of North Carolina? Yep, that's every year. Boston College? Yep, that's every year. First time for Clemson in the ACC tournament semifinals. And then team number 4 from the West Coast, Stanford, making their first ACC semifinal. So pretty interesting seeing the conference realignment. And I think it makes for, a fun, exciting postseason down the stretch.
Just a friendly reminder that ACC stands for the Atlantic Coast Conference.
And then you got Big Tens, seeing USC versus Michigan in the first round. So it's definitely some great games. I caught the end of Maryland as well. Michigan versus Maryland rematch on Friday night is going to be a great battle. Both teams have great defenses. Aggressive Dodgers, Corey Edmondson, looks in top form. So it's going to be a fun game Friday night.
Well, hey guys, let's move on here to the player perspective. We actually got a great inbound note from Division I women's college lacrosse player that listens to the podcast, and we wanted to talk about it here. The note was, I love your podcast. Would love to hear you guys talk about kids who are pretty above average at everything on the field versus kids who are really good at a few things. What do you all think is better? I'm a midfielder. I play all over. My job has always been kind of just to do what the team needs, whether that's putting up points, working in transition, or locking down on defense. This type of role is transitioned to the way I train to. I'm pretty good with both hands, can split dodge, roll dodge, etc. I like to be good at everything, so sometimes it's hard when I'm training because I want to be practicing everything. But I also wonder if I really just honed in on a few specific things, and if I could get those down, would that make me a better player? I just think this balance is interesting. It would be a cool topic to talk about. So, we all read that, shared it with each other, and I think it's one that struck with us personally, and also with a lot of athletes we work with. So, Deemer, I know you had some thoughts, or you want to take the first crack at this?
Yeah, to start, I think this is a great question. It's a great topic and something that a lot of athletes need to think about. Where it really changed for me, I can think back to my freshman year, and I got the opportunity at Duke to work with sports psychologist Greg Dale, who is pretty renowned in the field and, has since passed away and, had made an impact on so many athletes, at Duke University. And one of the things that he challenged me in some of our sessions was I had been spending a lot of time, in my case, working on my right-handed shooting, right-handed down the alley. And I was struggling to build confidence and struggling to feel like I was making progress. And then he asked me, what are your strengths and what are you doing to further your strengths? And, for me, it was my, lefty play and my lefty shooting. And that really flipped a switch for me because not only mentally was I so focused on my perceived weaknesses or lesser areas of my game, but I wasn't also utilizing enough time to maximize my strengths. And I know that that was freshman year of college. So some of this conversation needs to take in the player development timeline. But I think there's really something to be said for finding out what your strengths are, learning to maximize them and continue to make them stronger and elite while still trying to get better in other areas of your game and bring them up to be competent, to not be a liability throwing the ball with your weak hand or escaping a double team, for example. And I think that mentality is one that I would right now take a really hard stance at for athletes that are training and coaches that are trying to help certain athletes find their place on the field.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I do think it's one of those things, even as a coach, you think about it, where I think of in the past where I worked with players or had players on my team and they could improve in certain areas. And as a coach, I'm kind of like, hey, try not to be negative, but like, I think you do this, and this better, and like, keep working on it. And then you notice the player focus so hard on that and they stop doing the things that they're actually really good at. And it's a reminder of like, hey, lean into your strengths and I like your usage of be competent around that. Another piece of advice I would give players in this scenario is, one, use your coaches as feedback on what they kind of need from you and need from your role. Like, I think different schools and teams would expect that differently. You look at a Maryland, like the way they play offense or defense, particularly offense, like everybody kind of needs to be two-handed. They all end up in different spots. They all need to be able to move with and without the ball. They don't need big bags in their sticks to pull it from the outside. They need to be able to pass it and that type of thing. But some other schools might run a style of offense where you need to be more of a slasher dodger, or that's what they need from you. And so maybe you don't need to get so good at everything, but they're going to work to set you up for success in that role. So I don't know if there's a universal truth here, but I would say you want to guide what you're working on with like information from, your coaches and people around you.
Yeah, Matt, I think that's spot on. This is a topic that I've thought about a lot. And I think ultimately you have to be just really honest with yourself about who you are, but also what your goals are. And also, in terms of going to college, where do you want to play and where do you see yourself? On the women's side, for example, two-way midfielders are a thing, right? A lot of the best players in college are two-way midfielders that play offense, defense, they play on the draw, they do a bunch of different things. On the men's side, you really don't see many two-way midfielders, that are playing offense and defense and doing it at a high level. I can list maybe Zach Currier, Ryan Conrad, maybe someone like Sam English in recent years, but it's not really a thing. Back when I was in high school, I was on a high school team that, we weren't bad, but we weren't like phenomenal by any means. And, there were at times where my parents or, my family was like, well, you could play midfield and, help the team get the ball more. Maybe go back on defense because the ball's not getting to the offensive end that much. But for me, I was like, well, I know that when I get to college and the player that I want to be, like I want to be an attackman, and I know that's where my strengths are. So if I spend all of high school, focusing on maybe trying to be a two-way midfielder, that's going to take away from ultimately what I want to be and ultimately what I think I'll be good at. Like I had to be honest with myself. There's no way I can play defense in college against any of these like top midfielders. Like I know I can play attack and I know I want to play attack. So I think that helped frame it. So it's more so like similar to what you're saying, Matt, what I'm trying to get at. You just have to be really specific, just about what you want and about who you are. And I think that just comes from being honest. And, then when you go from like to a school perspective, well, if you're going to, an ACC or a Big Ten or an Ivy League school on the men's side, you're probably going to have to get pretty specific about what you're good at to get onto the field. Maybe at some other schools it could be different, but I think you just need to be honest. And then it also helps just take a look at the roster. Are there any guys or girls that are, playing a similar role to what I am? Because chances are you're going to continue to just slot into those roles because that's what the coaches want.
Well, I think going off that's where trying to understand, the role that you're in really matters, or the role that they've kind of guided you towards. Because when you're in that type of a role, the things that you should be working on and need to do to be successful become more evident. And then if you double down on those things versus all these other opportunities to develop skill in all these aspects of the game, if you double down on those areas that are more critical to your role, you're going to be more likely to start having success in that role. And that becomes possibly some things that you become great at and you become elite at. And I think that's the key. And that also can change. But even taking a step back, if we're thinking about a middle school player or we're thinking about a high school player, if you approach, and I'm just going to talk about offense, but I think we can apply this to every position. If you approach any specific offseason with the idea that you're going to work on everything, there is just too much stuff to be working on. No one has the time. No one in lacrosse is a full-time lacrosse player like maybe a homeschooled tennis athlete, or a homeschooled golf athlete who is spending 4 to 5 hours a day on their craft. We're getting a couple hours after school between practice and training and then strength stuff. So with that being said, you have to pick one or two things at times, be intentional, make some progress, and then you can keep that and then add other stuff as well. And then depending on your training environments, maybe there's some things that everything's rising with playing against better kids and, getting a good decision-making environment. But I just think that, if I'm coming out here and I'm trying to work on 5 different hitch moves, work on my step down shooting, work on my on the run shooting. Oh, sometimes I invert and I want to work on my question marks. Man, that really adds up. So I think you have to kind of chip away over time, especially middle school and high school. And then the roles that you start being slotted into, that's where I think you need to start doubling down so that you can have even more success And I think it translates very nicely too into a recruiting discussion around how you get noticed as well.
It's being a bit more intentional about your development. And I think, kind of like you talk about like anything you do, you can work really hard, but if you're working in the wrong direction or maybe not the most efficient direction, all that hard work might not translate. So you don't have to do this all the time, but from time to time, step back and either get feedback from a coach is one way to do it. Another more natural way to do it is look at somebody that's had success and try to model your game off of that and look at them and be like, that player has a ton of success. Here's what they do. And I think that would work for me. But then you have to keep reassessing and be like, am I really that kind of player? Like I played midfield in middle school and I stunk. And then a coach was like, hey, have you ever tried playing defense? And I did. And it was like way more natural for me. If I kept playing midfield, I could have worked really hard at these things, but my ceiling was it just was limited there. It just wasn't as good. And then these opportunities started to open up as I played defense and I saw other defenders and I was like, I can actually kind of like feel like I can do that. But my one coach said, hey, if your stick skills were better, you'd be like a varsity level player. Be like, okay, so I know like I'm good at this athletically, but my stick skills aren't good enough. And so that was like some feedback and micro moments like that kind of always helped me recalibrate on like at that point in time, what was the thing that was like holding me back from like a valuable role on a team. And so I think so many players work really hard and they say, I'm going to school early, I'm doing footwork, I'm doing wall balls. Like, okay, but if your stick's not the reason you're not playing, is the wall ball what you need to be doing? Right. Or if your footwork's not the reason you're not playing it, like it's great you're doing it. If you like doing it, you can continue. But is that going to move the needle for what you want? So I do think that piece of like recalibrating regularly and being intentional about what the work is you need to do and how to do it. I think the next piece is like what Deemer mentioned is it changes by age. Like if you're just getting started, like it's pretty universal. You got to be able to catch and throw. You got to have basic athletic literacy. You got to kind of be able to cut and change direction. And like, so at the beginning phases, it's like pretty universal of what you need to be able to do. The further along you get and the more advanced you get, that's where like the nuanced development comes along. And I remember hearing stories of like Kobe Bryant all summer shooting with his left hand for like nonstop because he was like, I am pretty good at these other things, but that's an area I feel like I can develop and grow as a scorer. Right. So when you think about these nuanced development, if you're like on a D1 team and you're trying to carve out a role and you can catch and throw well and do all this, it's like, well, I need to really get great at this skill, or I need to be able to cover way quicker guys. So my feet have to get even better. So I'm really going to train like this.
I'm going to use this as an opportunity here to use our podcast to speak directly to our athletes, but also speak to our parents on here that can share this with their sons and daughters. I think after the last couple years, whether it's a training session or small group or a film review, I've come across too many situations where I ask an athlete, what do you want to work on? And the answers that come back are, I don't know, shooting, dodging. And what I want to use this as an opportunity to say is that is not good enough anymore. I think that is too broad. And I think it's not intentional enough. And it tells me that as an athlete, you haven't gotten to the point yet where you're actually thinking about your game. And you're actually thinking about the areas on the field that you dodge from and that you play in and that your people are giving you feedback on, or you're not asking for feedback. And you're not learning about the game into like what people are doing out there. What did you see Pat Spencer do all these years? What did you see Grant Ament do all these years? Oh, you watched Coach Rehfuss at Syracuse? Like, how is he using his change of speed moves? What are you seeing Jake Taylor do on the crease and finish? How is CJ Kerr scoring 224 goals in his career? And I feel really strongly about that because, so many times, like, hey, like if someone's coming to work with us, if you don't have any idea of what you want to get better at, just doing mindless reps is, it's not a waste of time. It's great to get reps, but you're just not getting nearly as much out of it as if you just had some intention behind it. And shooting and dodging is the most generic thing I can think of when it comes to offense. And so this is a call to action for anyone that's listening to this. Start digging in more, be more specific, be more intentional, you don't need to keep signing up for a million training sessions if your answer is going to be, hey, I just want to work on shooting tonight. Think about all the videos and content that we put out that's showing all these different types of shots and types of dodges and types of off ball hedges and different movements. So that's just something I feel really strongly about. And Stephen, I'm curious your perspective, going on year 2 with us now, what your thoughts are around that as well.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. And I think, speaking of, the one thing that stood out was like, well, that's not enough anymore. And I think that also speaks to, college lacrosse and lacrosse in general. It's getting more competitive and it's getting better every year. Kids are going to more trainings, kids are going to, more club practices, more high school practices. Like, the game is evolving and it's getting better, right? If you look at recruits now versus 7 years ago, they're a lot better. And I think for people that are in these situations in high school where they want to get recruited and they want to go to these schools, it's like, okay, so does everyone else. So what are you going to do to continue to separate yourself? And the things that you're talking about, that's kind of where it starts in terms of separating yourself. Like, are you aware of what's going on in the college game? Are you aware of, what makes a really good player? Are you aware of yourself, what makes you good, but also some challenges that you're facing or some hurdles that you're not getting over in your game? So I think it's just being, once again, honest with yourself, and also then being honest with yourself. Like, how much do I love this game? How much do I care about this game? Do I really want to get better? Am I just here because it's something to do and some of my other friends are doing it? Or am I like passionate about it? And I think, every guest that we've had on, clearly ourselves, and, people that end up making it and playing at a high level, they are really passionate about it. They're passionate about the game. They're passionate about getting better. Overall, I definitely think that's spot on. And I think in terms of like our trainings, you can tell the kids that are at that level and you can tell the kids that aren't. And I think it stands out, and you can see, what kids are trying to work on day in and day out. Or are they going through the motions, or, are they being specific and targeted? And they're the ones that end up making that difference. From September to December, their game definitely changes.
Yeah, and I'll add, and we can wrap up after this unless you guys have final points. But like, Steven, you said the word enough, like, and you mentioned enough. And just so, like, I know what you guys meant by that, but I just want to clarify. Everybody does a lot right now. And if you look at like schedules, people are so busy, they're tired, and so we are constrained. Everybody's constrained in the time they have, in the money they have, in the energy they have to do these things. And so if you're inefficient with that, right, and you're not working smarter towards the things you want, like, it's not like going out and doing the extra footwork and stick work and practices are bad for you necessarily, in an absolute sense, but they're not as efficient as intentional work on the things that you want to and need to work on. And so what I've noticed is if you start getting really obsessed about what you need to get better at and you start trying to find answers, your questions are going to be more specific. So then when you're working on it, you're going to go to Deemer and be like, hey, I'm really thinking about how I can create value, and I'm watching like these clips and I'm trying this, but like I feel like I'm just, I can't get power with my offhand here, because I see this like move that I think it makes a lot of sense for me. That's being intentional, and that compounds over time, versus like, the player that's struggling shooting and they're already attackman, and after practice, they just shoot 100 sidearm shots high. And that's like still this with their feet set, right? So it's just like building the pattern that's not going to move the needle of actually being able to bounce and turn the corner with their left hand, or whatever they need to do for each person. And so I do think like hard work is great. Hard work in itself, it might not move the needle for you if it's not smart work and what you need to be doing. So I do think that's probably the biggest takeaway here is consistently challenge yourself to ask, is what you're doing the things that need to be done to get to where you want to go?
I think it, exactly what you're saying is, summed up by curiosity. Are you being curious? Are you trying to take that next step, be intentional, like we've talked about? And I think there is a process to that. I think, not everyone is going to be ready from day one. You kind of have to learn how to put in work, period, and be consistent about it. Then you can take those next steps also to be more refined with that. And then lastly, what I want to also clarify too with the enough statement is, we will never make you feel as a group that if you don't do more group training or you don't do more events, that you will be left behind or you won't get recruited. I think there's a lot of that FOMO driven anxiety in our sport and in youth sports in general. What I mean is more everything we're talking about is controllable and doesn't need just more things or more things to sign up for. It's just more intention from within, and it's more curiosity in the backyard and more watching college games. And that to me is what we're talking about here. We're not saying, oh, you need to go out and sign up for 3 more nights of structure, this and that, because that's not what we believe. Like we believe less is more on that front. And then what you need to do more of is wrestling with your own time and your own thoughts and working through your game a bit more, and then using the resources at your disposal, whatever they might be or whatever you might be fortunate enough to have, to then further that.
100%. And just want to say, if anybody has good questions or topics, submit them, because we love hearing what's on people's minds. And if we're able to, we'll talk about it in the podcast. We'll hit it in our newsletter. So we appreciate this question. If anybody wants to, feel free to reach out and submit some more. Guys, let's get to GPUs here. Stephen, let's have you kick us off.
All right, so my game of the week, it doesn't stand out, but I'll explain why. Army 20, Bucknell 11. Army right now sitting in a really interesting position. They cannot slip up in Patriot League play. They're a top 5 team right now, but their RPI is at 11 and their strength of schedule is at 27. So credit to them for taking care of Bucknell this weekend. But at the same time, this weekend, their big wins, all those teams lost. So UNC lost, Rutgers lost, UMass lost, and Navy lost. So Army just has to maintain incredibly disciplined. They're playing Loyola on Friday night. I do think that's a tough game. And then the Patriot League tournament, anything can happen. So, I just think the landscape overall, and this is why I highlighted it as my game, the landscape for the tournament right now is really up in the air. There's a lot that's going to happen in these next 2 weeks with the ACCs, with the Big Ten, with the Ivy, with the Patriot League. It really doesn't feel like anyone is safe at the moment, especially not for a home game by any means. So just something to monitor and to pay attention to. My player from Army, we talked about him at the start, Jackson Iger, 7-3 versus Bucknell, 73 points on the season, 45 goals. He's having a phenomenal year. And then Unit, Notre Dame offense. I turned on the game this weekend, Notre Dame versus UNC, and UNC was up 4-1 at half. I had group chats being like, wow, Notre Dame is dead. Like, what is going on with them? And then Notre Dame's offense, they rattle off 11 goals in the second half. Incredible to do that and incredible to just bounce back like that. I don't know what was said at halftime from Coach Corrigan. I think Ryder Garnsey works with the offense. I don't know exactly what was talked about, but to respond like that, whether it's, switching up your schemes or just switching up your energy, right? They looked like a different team in that second half. I do find that incredibly impressive. And those are the types of teams that are able to make those switches mid-game, that are able to, then win these bigger games in May like Notre Dame has done before.
Deemer, why don't you go next here?
All right. So for my game, I think Stephen might have thought he would get off easy. Last week
I didn't agree to it.
I threw a wager down. He must have had a feeling because he wouldn't agree to any sort of wager. I'm wondering why he's not wearing Duke merchandise right now. I'll have to send it to you. But Duke Syracuse, nonetheless, is my game of the week. Awesome home outing for Duke. Really impressed by the increased output in transition. Aidan McGuire with 2 and 1. Matt Christmas tying CJ Costabile's single season goals record for a long pull. And Eric Molliver, 5 goals on 8 shots. So really nice outing overall. I think, huge boost for them. They've got a big one against Virginia, which is always a battle. And, hopefully they'll position themselves well going into the ACC tournament. But that was great to watch. And, again, I think there's been a lot of people on the down and outs about Duke. I said this to you guys before. Nobody likes Duke in general across all sports. So that's natural. So, but big win for them. Excited for the guys and the staff there. Player, I got to call one of his games earlier in the season, but Ryan Bell, attackman, for Providence. He was 2-2 against Denver, leading the team to a massive win in the Bobby Benson era as they get ready for the Big East tournament. They've been fun to watch this year. They've got some really slick offensive players, and he's had a fantastic season. 40 assists, over 3 assists a game, leading the nation in assists. He's a really fun player to watch, great feel for the game, and that's my player for this week. And then unit, Princeton defense. We always talk a lot about the offense. You know, they're star-studded. They've got a lot of players, but defensively, only gave up 1 goal in the second half to Penn. They gave up 7 in the first half. So again, really nice outing there in the second half as the offense then put up 8 goals and they got a big Ivy win.
Awesome. I'll wrap it up here. For my game, I have Maryland versus Hopkins. Maryland won 11-8. That is, so one big thing about this game, 22nd straight season with at least 10 wins for Maryland, which is a pretty cool stat. And Coach Tills mentioned post-game that is not something he takes for granted. Definitely not something they, talk about all the time, but I think just a byproduct of the way they do things. So just kind of a cool thing to highlight there. Hopkins has won the last 2 regular season games here. And anybody that, kind of knows the history of lacrosse, like the Maryland Hopkins game is one of the oldest rivalries and an in-state rivalry there. That's a big deal for both of these teams. So typically, no matter like how either team is doing that season, this is a game that is a very hard battle. Maryland was up 6-5 at half, kind of led most of the game. They were up 8-7 at the end of the third, and then 9-8 in the fourth, and pulled away to get it to 11-8. I thought a cool quote from Eric Kolar was talking about their defense. He mentioned, after each time we've been scored on, I think as a group we have a lot of poise. We're honest. We have a lot of trust. Trying to prevent back-to-back goals is a big deal for us. And talking about the offense, we have trust that when we get a stop, we're going to go right down and score. And I just think that is like, that quote sums up a really important mindset for teams and units of just like the poise when things don't go well. And we talked about the 0-0 mindset, but also this idea of like bending, but not breaking, where you understand things aren't going to go your way, but you take a lot of pride in not letting them get out of control. So that was a poise quote. And I think just, Maryland played, they had a good defensive game. They've been great defensively all year. They had some great production on offense. Eric Shaw was 4-1. And then, a little bit of transition going where, AJ Larkin had a nice play, getting a pass from Schaller up the field and sparking some transition at a big time there. Hopkins won the specialty positions. Their goalie, Johannes, had 20 saves and saved at 65%. And they were, I believe, a little over 60% at the faceoff. So just a scenario where Maryland was able to capitalize on possession efficiency, but Hopkins definitely kept it close and was battling. For my player, Aiden McGuire, we've mentioned him, I think, at least 2 times so far on the podcast today. He was 2-1 versus Cuse. He is number 23 for Duke, short stick defensive midfielder. He has 24 calls turnovers on the season, which is the most by any non-long pole, and pretty head and shoulders. There's maybe another D-Midi that has close to 20 or around 20, but really that whole list is all poles. Not that calls turnovers is everything, but if you just look at McGuire, he's typically the most athletic guy on the field, and a guy that when you dodge him, you're not only just trying to beat him, but you're trying not to get the ball taken away. He's really good at those kind of crowbar checks, those deep wraps, extremely athletic and a threat in transition. He's a junior right now. Stephen mentioned earlier, he's probably the best short stick defensive midfielder in Division I lacrosse. If not, he's in, elite company there. And so he's a guy that I think has been standing out last year and this year, but now really had a big game in that win over Cuse. And my unit, lastly, is Loyola's offense. Loyola put up 16 goals to beat Navy, 16-11. Loyola started off the season 0-9. They've won 3 of their last 4, and now they basically have a shot at going to the Patriot League tournament, and they're still alive as far as their season goes right now. So after an 0-9 start, to have that resilience is huge. Matthew Minikis had 8 points, was 5-3. He's been a guy that, if you follow their box scores throughout the season, has had a really good year. So I just want to give a shout out to Loyola there. In backs kind of against the wall these last few weeks, able to rebound, and that offense had a great night in the win over Navy.
Well, one thing I wanted to add about Loyola, and it's cool for them to see how the back half of the season they're really starting to, get some wins and avenge some of the pains that they went through early in the season. And regardless how their season ends up finishing, what I think is going to be really exciting for them is that I believe I had tweeted it, but either 10 of 11 or 11 of 12 of their top point scorers are all juniors or younger. So talk about a group that is going to have a huge opportunity ahead of them to get better over the summer, to keep bonding, and then use all the pain, keep all the receipts from all the posts talking about how they haven't won a game in 9 games or whatever it was, and then come back next year and avenge 1-goal losses and avenge, conference. It's not a team that, if they get really aligned on their mission, growing from this year to next year, that's going to be fun to face. So I think that's interesting with so many guys coming back.
100%. And, we've mentioned that staff. They have long-standing staff, their history of success. A lot of credit to them. It's not, and a lot of their losses early were 1-goal losses to good teams. It's not easy being 0-9, and to be resilient enough to come back and not let that break you, I think is a great testament to them. Guys, moving forward here, let's bring in Adam Lamberti, special guest here, to talk about some college lacrosse in the PLL draft.
How you doing, guys? Thanks for having me.
What's up, Adam? Welcome to the
Awesome.
show.
Spent a lot of time looking through the podcast, but pumped to be on it.
Yeah, well, it's awesome to have you. For those that don't know, Adam is our FCL director of media. He's been with us full time, I think, going on year 3, right? Coming up. And, he's been really the brains and the engine behind creating so much great content, as, especially this spring, as we've been firing a lot of different stuff and, adding the podcast. So, Adam, you're doing an awesome job. One, it's been awesome to hear the support from our community about the different types of content that we're putting out. But then 2, you're doing an awesome job prepping your PLL draft board, and working for the league and, using what you're watching at the college level, to start doing some draft prep and coverage and putting out some articles around some of the top guys. So maybe to kick this off, give us a little insight on your process and, what it's been like starting to, build and evolve your draft board for this season.
Yeah, I mean, kind of like you said, like just watching like all the college lacrosse, like you kind of get a good idea of like, some of the top players and maybe some of like the top skills, of these players. And, it's been something like even like just dating back to college, like I remember just being like, like everyone watches like college lacrosse, but when the PLL was starting, it's like, it took a little bit for like the draft to build momentum. And if you think about like the NFL draft is today, like I'm sure you guys have seen, so many like pieces of coverage, like, mock drafts, even just on social media, like all that stuff, so I think in the back of my head, like with all of the college lacrosse I watch, it was just something I've always wanted to do.
That's awesome, Adam. And talking about the college lacrosse, like it feeds into both, right? You watch a ton of college lacrosse, helps with the draft board, but you've also been running an On the Run newsletter. This is your second year doing it with us. Where in the season, you've been putting out a newsletter every Tuesday, basically covering the action from last week's games. Curious for you, we just talked about our games, players, and units. Each week, you're covering all of these games. Any teams, players, or units this year that have really stood out to you in college lacrosse?
Yeah, well, I mean, this one's kind of like a gimme, but like Cornell's attack and like offense in general, I think we all knew that they were going to be really good. Like obviously Goldstein last year burst onto the scene, and then Curse and Michael Long, have been there for a while. I don't think a lot of people expected it to this degree. I'm not sure about you guys. And I think what's especially important too is like, they got some like guys on their second midfield stepping up. Ryan Waldman, Brian Luzzy's had a few good games. Andrew Dalton's been stepping up, and people forget that they're without, one of their top midfielders, AJ Nikolic, who was a freshman last year, who had a season-ending injury, I think, before the season started. So I know like that's kind of a cop-out answer, because like, yeah, Cornell's number one, like they're the favorite to win, but I think they've exceeded already like high expectations for a lot of people.
Yeah, those are hard. I mean, to your point, like it feels like a cop-out answer now, but for them, like still executing is a lot of pressure, and a lot of teams come in with high expectations each year. So I think we've been talking a lot like they deserve the credit right now, and it's not an easy thing to do. So that's a very fair point. They just put up 20 goals against Harvard this past weekend.
Yeah, and I think if you even look at like from a stats perspective, like I'm just pulling up the like NCAA stats, like they lead the country in assists per game. They lead the country in points per game. I believe they still lead the country in shooting percentage. Yeah, they lead in all these categories. So is it an easy cop out? Oh, I wouldn't even say so. Like this is one of the best offenses that we've seen. We've talked a lot about Notre Dame, I guess, from like last year, and then Maryland in, I guess, 2022 was it? But Cornell's offense is, super dynamic. They're playing at such a high level. And, it's not that often that you see the tour in favorite also be really complemented by like some extremely high level players.
Totally. And I think, I don't even know, like to your point, Stephen, I don't know what he's at now, but I remember looking maybe like 2 weeks ago and CJ Kurse's shooting percentage was at 50. And you think about a guy that's, scoring that many goals. I don't know what he's at on the season. 60 probably something. But shooting 50% for that amount of goals is ridiculous. And it just shows like they just generate quality chances, like he's not shooting just to shoot.
Yeah, he's got 59 goals right now and is at 50% shooting percentage. That is unheard of.
Yeah, and going off that, his career percentage is 37. So 30% as a freshman, still had 55 goals, 36% as a sophomore, 65 goals, 32% as a junior, 45 goals, and now he's up to 49%. And I think too, the emergence of Ryan Goldstein, like some of the games when you have him at like 6 goals or 7 goals, he is scoring in so many different ways, which I think just skyrockets his value because he's such a lacrosse player. He cuts, he moves, he's getting doorstep dunks, but then he can also, beat you off the dodge. But to have a 49%, kind of, some of his shots he's getting too, is attributed to, like you said, the supporting cast and Goldstein really stepping up in that X role.
Yeah, and just to tie in, and then we can get off Cornell if we want. But like Deemer, you're talking about that Loyola group, how they're younger, how they're going to get older, use this year. CJ Kurse, you just highlighted his freshman year. He had 55 goals. Well, that freshman year, they were also playing in the national championship game, and I believe lost to Maryland by 2. So when you look at this group's experience, they missed the NCAA tournament last year, but they've been there before. He's been there before, which I do think is just going to pay off a lot, come May.
So Adam, let's switch off Cornell here. Where does your mind take you in terms of some other prospects, units, people that have really caught your eye this spring?
Yeah, well, I think one of late has been Providence. The past 2 games, like they're kind of a team that feels like is getting hot at the right time. They beat Marquette. People forget they beat Marquette 14-2 2 weeks ago. Like Marquette's a good team. They've had close games. I believe Georgetown just beat them in overtime. And then they followed that up with a 10-6 win over Denver. In Denver, up 9-2 at half, kind of just controlled that game. Like they're a team that, will they make a bunch of noise in the NCAA tournament? Maybe, maybe not. But like you look at like we were talking about before the show, like the Big East is kind of as open as it's been. And if you want to talk about a team that like maybe hasn't had the national headlines, some of the other teams we've been talking about in the past few years, like Providence is a team like they can win the Big East tournament, and dare I say, like even be like one of the favorites heading into it. I'm not sure like where they'd lie on that, but like, I mean, they have all the momentum. They finish up the Big East regular season against St. John's, which figures to be a win. And it's just like, there's something to be said about like building that momentum and peaking at the right time heading into your conference tournament. And then who knows?
You've got Ryan Bell. We were just talking about Ryan earlier on GPUs. You've got him, I think right now, 61st on your draft board.
Yeah, I mean, he's a guy like definitely like a little undersized, but you look at a guy like just a true quarterback of the offense. And I would even say like that attack unit as a whole is one of the most underrated I've seen. Jack Horgan, who actually went to my high school, played with him at McDonough, is just a lefty shooter, had 4 against Denver, just step downs, putting it in good spots. And then you got Richie Joseph, who I believe is a junior on the right side, just a righty score complement to Horgan. And then obviously you have Bell at X feeding both of them. I think he's got 40 assists on the season. He's had games where he's had 8 assists, 6 assists. Like they just work so well together. And then you think about, some of the midfielders they got, like Rhett Chambers. They got a lot of young guys, stepping up. Ben Dale, who's a best-in-class attendee, has been getting significant minutes. It just seems like they complement each other so well with their skill sets, especially on the attack.
Yeah, and I'm looking at Providence now because I'm, tracking through the Big East is like it's tough because you beat Denver 6-10, you beat Marquette 14-2, lose to Villanova by 3, lose to Georgetown by 3, lose to St. Joe, or not out of conference, but then you look at like a Marquette where, to your point, Adam, Marquette loses to Villanova 14-3. They lose to Georgetown by 1. Villanova, as we looked at early, very talented, but has like, barely kind of scraped by some games, and they end with Georgetown here. So I do think it's cool to see Providence, where typically you've seen Denver, you've seen Villanova, you've seen Marquette have success in the Big East. And now Coach Benson's a couple years in. And I think we're actually seeing some like really good production and consistent production from that team that I like, at least in my time playing and following college lacrosse, Providence never really seemed to crack that like level.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think like that's the exciting part. And I think like to your point, Matt, like the Big East is kind of like everyone's beating up on everyone, or there's a bunch of close games, on any given weekend, any given game, someone can beat someone. And I think there's a lot to be said for like heating up at the right time, like getting that confidence going into the tournament. And I think Providence probably has a lot of that.
Adam, questions here. I want to talk a little bit about some of these draft prospects. And I think everybody feels pretty strongly that CJ Kirst is, a number 1 pick. Probably more strongly than any year in the past. But even last year you had like O'Neal, but there was Schellenberger and there was Pat Cav and Ajax, and not that there aren't other great players, but I just think, Kirst has really emerged as that. I'm wondering which guys you really think, well, 1, if you disagree with that, let me know. But 2, what guys are really competing for that next level of like pick? Who are the next layer of guys that are right there, but maybe not competing with CJ for it?
Yeah, I'll add, I think CJ, like just to start off CJ, I think the reason people think so highly of him, and I know you guys too, is like the way he can play any role in an offense. Like he feels like such a safe bet, to be a good pro, just because like Deemer said, he can score, he can dodge, but he's elite off ball. He's got both hands. You can kind of put him anywhere on the field. So I think like that combined with his scoring prowess is why a lot of people see that. And I think some of the other guys, like Chris Kavanaugh has been a name, that's been up there a lot, and Andrew McAdory, like those are the kind of 2. And you even think about it, like, yeah, they're probably not having like the best years that they had of their college career, but like their skill sets could just be so dynamic for the PLL. Like Chris Kavanaugh is amazing at like creating his own shot and opportunities, especially late in the shot clock or kind of those like scramble situations. And you think like in the PLL where it's quicker, like he's incentivized to be able to do that. And then you think about a guy like Andrew McAdory, who's playing primarily offense, for Duke, mixing in that attack and midfield. Like he's a guy that I think a lot of teams, will put him on the wing, off a face-off when you have a 32-second shot clock. He's a guy, can create instant offense. So those are 2 that their kind of skill sets and their potential, project well at the next level.
I think going off that, one thing that always stands out to me, I feel like, even some of the years before the PLL, MLL, then into PLL, there's something to be said for the legs coming right out of college. And we saw Dordovic have a really notable impact for your squad, Matt, on his first season, from the 2-pointers to the dodging to the initiating, like just being in that college peak shape coming right into the season. That's where I think someone like McAdory could really blow the doors off. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Adam, pick 3, that's Redwoods, right? New GM, Joe Spallina, who coached him with the Crush, right? 91 Crush. So, to me, that's a no-brainer pick right there, that he's going to be this do-it-all guy, but also like bring that identity too, that when a pro team starts to form their identity and a culture of guys and it's aligned, then all the other decisions around, guys on the periphery and filling out the roster, it will drive a lot of those supporting cast roles too.
And I think a guy like McAdory, like you said, like does whatever's asked of him. He can he's kind of a chess piece, and like he can play attack. Like if you need in a pinch, his value is probably off the wings in the middle of the field in transition, but like you can stick him in a bunch of different positions and kind of build around that, like move him around a little.
Let's just flip the script here a little bit, to defense and pull. I remember last year yourself and, I think Paul Kark, a few were really high on Weyer and Levi Virch, as some polls, disruptive guys. Virginia's obviously had a more down season, so Weyer hasn't been, as much a part of the mainstream headlines and highlights. And then Lavelle's the top force in the Ivy League, and Scott Smith, those are the 4 that you looks like you kind of more having like your top 20 or so. So talk a little bit about those guys and what the chatter is around them, heading into the draft.
Yeah, I think those are probably, the top 4 on a lot of coaches' board. And I think it's kind of like they all bring like different kind of skill sets. So it kind of just depends on, one might go higher than the other, but it's, maybe because they're looking for this type of skill. So you think about like a Ben Weyer, it's like it's a strictly LSM, his value is goal scoring and pushing offense in the middle of the field. And then you can kind of say the same about Levi Virch. He's just a ground ball vacuum, probably projects as an LSM if I had to guess at the next level. He's played a little bit of both. And then if you look at, a close guy like Brendan Lavelle, like he can kind of be, a day 1 starter down low, kind of a bigger body. I know he kind of blew up last year for his performance on Brendan O'Neill. Just did a really good job in that matchup. And then a guy like Scott Smith is interesting. I've talked to a few coaches. He actually played a little bit of LSM during his time at Hopkins, so he's kind of a guy that you can move around a little bit as well. So it's kind of like, it just kind of depends like what skill set you're looking for, if you need a close guy, if you need an LSM, if you're looking for more goal scoring ability from your polls, just kind of depends.
But yeah, and you kind of draft, like you draft for need or for talent, depending on how great the talent is and how big your need is, right? And so when you look at like, the Whip Snakes last year, we draft Ajax Zapatello 3rd. We needed a guy that can cover the quicker guys, and Ajax matches up with matches up very well with a certain archetype of attackman. It's PLL markets all the time, Sowers and all that, but he covers those guys really well. And so you look at this draft, it's like, who do you have personnel wise? Do you have somebody that matches up? Can you cover the ball well at close against quick guys? Do you need a Brendan Lavelle because you need somebody that can cover Brendan O'Neill or some of these bigger dodging bodies? Do you need a presence in the middle of the field? Ben Weyer, Scott Smith is like, hey, maybe he's not the best cover guy. Maybe he's not the best LSM, but he can kind of he's versatile and he can fill the gaps and he plays really hard and he's tough. And we like that about him, so you kind of look at those different needs and I'm sure those are the conversations all the coaches are having right now. But I do tend to agree that you look at, those are probably the guys standing out the most. And the other thing that is a little different in the PLL is you have the 2-point line. So if you have an LSM that's good for 3 to 6 2-pointers over the course of the year, that's a pretty big addition.
Now, guys, one thing I'm curious about, and is even as I dip down the board, I'm moving down. I'm looking at 17 and 18 on your board, Adam, Mick Kelly and Matt Trainer. I think two guys that can be personally, I think can be impactful pros. Go a little farther, into the 20s. You've got Casey Wilson at short stick. You've got Jimmy Freehill at close D. Alex Marinier, big time goal scoring season for Ohio State. I'm curious too, even for process and probably a little self-reflection as well. If this draft class, like say you take the same class, but we had the results of last season, you probably might have Casey Wilson and Freehill in that top 15, right? Because of how Denver's defense maybe was, bursting onto that national scene. So when you think about your process, is it hard to fight some of the recency bias of the 2025 college season and thinking about, well, here's how the unit's done. But then if you can remove yourself from that, you've got some really good individual prospects here that could plug in. And why couldn't Casey Wilson, make a big time, D-Midi impact where he's up for D-Midi of the year, right? Like, how do you think about that when you're going through your process?
Yeah, totally. That's a great question. I kind of think like, yeah, like I think production and, the type of year they're having too, but it's also like, I like looking for, kind of like different traits and like, you have 32 picks in the draft. You kind of, if you're a coach, you kind of need to draft very specifically and a lot of times based on like a very specific skill. So like, like Casey Wilson, like converted offensive midfielder, like if you're looking for a guy, that can push off the wings and push in transition, that's a guy that can provide some goal scoring pop. And, another thing that a few coaches have said to me, it's like, on paper, like obviously like last year's draft was, tabbed as one of the best, because you had all the COVID years were kind of coming to an end. It was just a really good class of people. But like this class, it's like coaches said, like the more they looked at it, like the deeper it gets, like it might not have the top end talent, like in the first round that last year did. But like you said, Deemer, like you can get a Casey Wilson, a Jimmy Freehill in the late second, third round, and those guys could be quality starters for you.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I was in the same boat where I think we all were a little enamored with last year's class because it had been kind of built up for a little while. And you kind of looked at the big names that are for the next year. And after the first three, it kind of dropped off. But as you watch this season, I agree with you where you get lower and you look at like all of those guys. And even like this board has Logan McNaney 24th overall. That could be true. Logan could also potentially be a first round goalie, depending on, you don't know, or get drafted in the fourth round and start. I think there will be guys this year that will get picked later on because it's harder to read because they're doing well in a unit and college lacrosse in general, right? This year is a little bit flatter where all of these teams are a little bit more competitive. There's not like these four teams. There's not like Notre Dame and Duke and Virginia that have all this star power and are dominating, but there's kind of guys buried. So it'll be cool where some guys will get drafted late, maybe picked up supplemental, go to training camp, probably play really well, earn a spot onto a roster, and probably be an impact player this summer that might be a fourth round pick.
Yeah, the great point, Matt. And I think like that's even something coaches have said. They're even planning for like after the draft too, like because there's going to be guys there, maybe positions like goalie or like short stick D midfield, even attack, where they're kind of already planning for that contingency, where they're already looking at guys who they want to pick up that go undrafted.
Yeah, it's hard. You get to 29. I think it's now 29 guys to camp maybe this summer. If you have a lot of returners, you can maybe bring 3 or 4, and then you think about like positions. So does that mean 3 goalies? How many middies do you bring? And it gets hard. And then there's going to be really good players that can play that won't be able to go to camp. And so like to your point, Adam, like I know how hard your job is doing this. And I talk to other like the coaches and the players where they're like calling college coaches, trying to watch the games, trying to get a feel for these guys and think like, how will that game translate over to the next level? And where pro lacrosse is at right now, which is taking great steps, it's still not at a point like the NFL where the eval process, the way how in-depth it is with scouts and combines and all of that.
Well, and guys, we made that point in one of our recruiting discussions probably 3 or 4 podcasts ago, where even in the NFL, when they talk about the re-signing of the first round draft picks over the last 10 years, that number is 50% and lower based on position, in terms of people being able to use all the metrics and data that they have at their disposal and then properly predict. So it just shows that across any sport, this is a really difficult task. And, guys, I'm scrolling down the list here, and when I'm looking in the 40s and 50s, I'm looking at, Devin McClain, I'm looking at Jack Stuzen, Gian Fricaro, Cam Rubin, Michael Long, Richie LaCalandra, like there's a lot of names in here that then the specificity on like what you're drafting and picking up that guy for, and then how are you going to use them versus if you're just going to run an offense that you're asking Michael Long to be the Dodger out of the box. Well, yeah, you're never going to suit him up because that, it's just not what he's going to be elite at, but if you have a really thoughtful GM and a really thoughtful coach that's going to put the pieces together, but then also try to structure an offense that puts the people in places to be successful, well, then that's when it's not about just getting the flashy first round guys. You don't need 6 number ones out there. That's where if you've got your guy that's a number one, then you're not drafting Chris Kavanaugh. Like you're maybe drafting Jake Taylor because you need a guy that can finish everything like Xander Dixon's impact on the Atlas.
Yeah, and I think you kind of saw that, and we can certainly move to wrap up here. And Deemer, your point about the fresh college legs is true, but it's also some of those guys are beat up coming out of college too. And so you maybe saw that with Pat Cavanaugh a little bit this past summer, where he went to the Cannons, but they kind of brought him out of the box. And, they already had 2 righty attackmen, and Asher played at X and Marcus played on the right side more. And so I think it was a struggle to fit. We all know Pat Cavanaugh is going to be a great pro, but I do think there's an element of some of these guys come off a college season and they're burnout because they just went to the championship and they play all year and they're played through injuries. We saw that like with Ajax a little bit, and some of these guys, like it's hard, especially the guys that go deeper and play through injuries. And 2, like it's like maybe if a team drafts for talent, they're like, this guy's so good, we have to have him, but we're just going to try to plug him in somewhere that he hasn't really been before in an offense that he doesn't know as well. That is another like thing to consider into it. So some of those guys, maybe it takes a year or 2 to find their pro legs and get on the right team.
Adam, one guy I'm just really curious about here, and I haven't taken as much time to look into it, but what's the deal with Dylan Hess? Why is he at Florida? He's a guy that no one's talking about this spring, but he's got all the athletic tools, to be an impact player. But hey, maybe risky being a year removed from playing high-level Division I lacrosse. What's that storyline look like?
Totally. I think you hit the nail on the head. I believe he was trying to play football at Florida, trying to walk on the football team. And then I don't think he made the team, I believe is the story. So he's like, you know what, I'm just going to play club at Florida. I played 4 years at Georgetown, and obviously we know what his body of work is at Georgetown, big, strong, athletic defensive midfielder. But Deemer, to your point, the concern is kind of like, he's playing attack at Florida right now. Like he's not playing true short stick D-midi. And like, of course, the quality of talent isn't going to be what you see when you're playing out of Georgetown. So the biggest question is, how ready is he going to be? Like he hasn't played, Division I short stick D-midi in over a year. Like, and there's some other guys, that have, he's still going to get drafted. He's still probably going to be a good pro, but that's kind of the question a lot of coaches have.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It's helpful. Even, you're looking at Ben Ramsey, you're looking at English, you've got O'Berry on here. We talked about Casey Wilson. We know how valuable that 2-way / D-midi role is. And then there's obviously a lot of great ones that have been able to sustain themselves in the league, like a Pat Resch, who's just been such a consistent presence. And if a coach really believes in a certain rope unit, they're going to keep those guys on. So this has been awesome, Adam. It's been fun working through these names, working through some of these guys. Appreciate your insights. Keep crushing, all the work that you're doing on the PLL side. And obviously, we're cranking away here at FCL with you through all of our content. But awesome stuff today. Thanks for coming on.
All right, Stephen, you want to go looking ahead here into some notable games this upcoming weekend?
Yeah, on the men's side, some big games. So 7 p.m. Friday night, Villanova at Georgetown. Villanova currently undefeated in Big East play. The Big Ten quarterfinals. Hopkins is at Penn State at noon on Saturday, and Rutgers is at Michigan 1 p.m. Saturday. Both Ohio State and Maryland have byes into the semifinals. On the ACC front, Duke is at UVA. That's 3 p.m. Saturday, ACC Network. The winner of this game gets into the ACC tournament. Duke is looking, this is a crazy stat, for their 20th straight regular season win over UVA. They have just dominated them in regular season games. I believe UVA's last win over Duke, and Deemer, correct me if I'm wrong, would be 2019 when UVA beat Duke in the men's Final Four in the semifinals. And then last big game of the weekend, UNC is at Syracuse. That's 5 p.m. on the ACC Network. Both these teams in interesting positions, top 10 or so teams, but they both need, more big wins. And then also when you're talking about tournament time, one, home seed, but two, also getting in. And I believe this game will have big implications on the ACC tournament seeding. And then, next week's pod, we'll start previewing that ACC tournament. But a lot of big games on the men's side that we're looking forward to. And then on the women's front, the ACC tournament and Big Ten tournament continues. So this is dropping Friday morning. So today on Friday, it'll be 5 p.m. UNC versus Clemson, and then 8 p.m. BC versus Stanford. The ACC Women's Championship game is going to be at noon on Sunday. And then on the Big Ten front, Friday as well, Friday, 5 p.m. Northwestern versus Hopkins, and then 7:30 on Friday, Maryland versus Michigan. That championship game will be on 4 p.m. Sunday. So, if you want to check out women's lacrosse on Sunday, you'll have a noon championship game from the ACC and a Big Ten championship game at 4 p.m. from the Big Ten. So big weekend coming up for, men's and women's lacrosse. Of note, this is the last weekend of regular season games for, I believe, both men's and women's lacrosse. And that just speaks to, a lot of schools, they're going to be done after this weekend. Not everyone makes the conference tournament. And then even if you do, not many teams are making the NCAA tournament. So crazy that it's April 24th. This will drop April 25th. And we're talking about seasons already being over. Feels like the season just started. But, obviously now we're getting into that second season of tournament time, which is when it matters.
Awesome. Well, guys, great stuff today. This was a blast as always. We really appreciate, our community tuning in. One thing that we would ask is we appreciate you sharing the podcast with other friends, family members, and fans of the game as we continue to build and evolve. We appreciated one of the questions that was submitted for this week's Players Perspective. So if you have more ideas or things you'd like to hear us talk about, just email contact@firstclasslacrosse.com. And we were lucky to have Adam on today. The link to his On the Run newsletter, free Tuesday newsletter, is below in the description for YouTube, Apple, and Spotify, as well as Weekly Thought and Coach's Corner that we've talked about prior. So, guys, great stuff today. Excited to see how these tournaments start to shake out, and a lot to keep talking about here as we get into the last 4 to 5 weeks of the season.
Awesome. Thanks, guys. See ya.
See you guys.